So, what about extinctions? So, when we trace the evolution of life over geologic time, it seems that up to 99% of all species that have existed are now extinct. So, at points in the Earth's history, these extinctions happened quickly and en masse. These are referred to as mass extinctions. So, the assumption is that organisms will always be evolving towards higher order or greater complexity. However, vertebrates are far more complex than bacteria. However, bacteria have survived for 3.5 billion years. So when it comes down to it, the most likely organism to survive aren't always the most complex. So natural selection will not yield a perfect organism. What it does is it produces an organism that's adapted to a specific set of circumstances at a particular time. So a lizard that exists now is in no way superior to a lizard that lived in the Triassic. We need to bear that in mind. So extinctions occur in two kinds. The first kind is a background extinction, and that's just a continual loss of species, and that's a relatively consistent process. The other type of extinction is a mass extinction, and that's a period of accelerated extinction rates which sharply reduces the Earth's biotic diversity. So you'll see lots of organisms dying out very, very quickly. So extinction is a continual process, but so is the evolution of new species. So as one species dies out, its niche will be taken over by a new species. And these new species will typically quickly emerge to exploit the opportunities left as another species becomes extinct. So when the dinosaurs died out, the niches that they left were very quickly taken over by the mammals and the birds. So although we think of the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous as large, actually it wasn't the biggest one that's occurred. So that honour goes to the extinction event that occurred at the Permian-Triassic boundary 250 million years ago, which is referred to as the Permo-Trias mass extinction. And estimates of the Permo-Trias mass extinction vary, but it seems that up to about 96% of all marine invertebrates were killed off, and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrates were made extinct. So this was an absolutely massive mass extinction, and we'll be discussing why it occurred when we do the Paleozoic Earth history. But nevertheless, you can see from this diagram here that there have been several mass extinctions. So you can see as this diagram gets wider, essentially that represents an increasing numbers of species. So the wider the distance, the more species exist. But you can see every once in a while the number of species suddenly drops. So these are the mass extinctions. So we then get an increase in the number of species, mass extinction, increase in the number of species, mass extinction, and so on. So these mass extinctions are not uncommon in the slightest. They are very, very common in the geologic record. And so obviously these mass extinctions are then going to open up numerous environmental niches, and life will very quickly rush to try and fill those open niches. So let's talk about the end of the Cretaceous, and also obviously that means the end of the dinosaurs. So the Cretaceous tertiary boundary, which is sometimes referred to as the KT boundary, marks an extinction event. Now, this extinction event was not only devastating for the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs, but it also did some pretty serious damage to marine invertebrate communities. So we see the ammonites, and we see the rudists, and we see lots of different types of plankton, so single-celled photosynthesizing organisms, dying out at the end of the Cretaceous. Now, the reason for this mass extinction was debated for some time. For a while we thought the Cretaceous tertiary mass extinction was due to the Deccan Traps flood basalt eruptions which were taking place in what is now modern-day India. So in that area during the Cretaceous we have huge fissure eruptions pouring out vast quantities of magma onto the surface of the Earth, and the model went that the carbon dioxide that was being pumped into the atmosphere ended up causing a greenhouse effect, Combine that with all the other gases, so like hydrogen sulfide, chlorine gases, fluorine gases entering the atmosphere, that would eventually lead to the formation of things like acid rain, which might affect soil pH or seawater pH, whilst the chlorine and fluorine would enter the atmosphere, and that would obviously affect the ozone layer, and so that might lead to increased amounts of ultraviolet radiation making it to the surface of the Earth. And so you can see how the Deccan traps, has the capacity at least to lead to a mass extinction. But it was never quite large enough. It was always a little bit difficult to explain how, granted, a very large volcanic eruption was capable of causing a global and very, very powerful mass extinction event. So it didn't quite work. It was a good enough argument, but it just seemed a little bit small compared to the actual total size of the Cretaceous tertiary mass extinction. Now, this changed in 1980. So in 1980, a 2.5 centimetre thick clay layer at the Cretaceous tertiary boundary was analysed, and it was found to be extremely rich in an element called iridium. So just to give you some idea, this here is actually the layer of clay that was sampled. So you can see it's a clay layer that's running through here. There are limestones below it and limestones above it. And you can actually see there are some circles drilled into the rock here. This is where rock samples have been taken for analysis. And so what some scientists were doing is they were just simply taking rock samples through this sequence, and they were analysing them because they were trying to come up with a new dating method for dating sedimentary rocks. And it just so happened that one of the elements they were using to try and date the sedimentary rocks was iridium. Now, iridium is a very, very rare element. So because it's highly sidrophile, that means iron-loving, when the Earth went and formed its iron core, nearly all of the iridium that was present in the early Earth went and sequestered itself in the Earth's core. And so this means that the Earth's mantle and the Earth's crust is very, very iridium poor. So just to give you some idea, the average iridium concentration in the Earth's crust is 500 parts per trillion. So that's a very, very low concentration. So the fact that we see this sudden increase in iridium in this clay layer here is extremely interesting to geologists. So the question then becomes well, where do we find large quantities of iridium? Well, you can find them in certain types of mineral deposit. However, this clay layer is absolutely nothing to do with the formation of ores, so it's nothing to do with that process. The only other place where we find iridium in large concentrations is asteroids. So as soon as you see this iridium anomaly, and as soon as you think, well, what could cause it? Well, asteroid is the only logical answer. Well, then all of a sudden you begin to think, well, maybe the Cretaceous tertiary mass extinction is due to some kind of impact event. Now, once you have that idea, then you can go and look at the other evidence, and you can see, right, does an impact event match with the evidence that I'm seeing? So obviously an impact event would be consistent with the iridium anomaly. The asteroid that would hit the Earth would have contained quite large quantities of iridium when compared to the concentration in the Earth's crust. And so when the asteroid hit the surface of the Earth, obviously the asteroid would have been mostly destroyed. That would have thrown huge amounts of dust into the air, and mixed in with that dust would have been pieces of the asteroid, and that dust would essentially have fallen across the entire surface of the Earth, and essentially this dust, this ejecta layer, would then go to form this clay horizon, which we can see here and here. Another thing that we see is that the iridium isotopes present in this clay layer are a little bit off. So the iridium isotope ratio that we see for the Earth is going to be different to the iridium isotope ratio that we get for things like asteroids. And so when we look at the iridium isotopes present in this clay layer, we see that they are most closely related to the type of ratios which we would expect to find associated with asteroids. Now, another thing that we see is that we see in the rocks associated with the impact, and as part of the clay layer, we have pieces of quartz which show a very, very distinctive texture called shocked quartz. You can actually see a picture of it right here. So here's a quartz crystal down a microscope, and you can see that it has all of these parallel lines. And these parallel lines are the result of essentially a pressure wave passing through the crystal, compressing it and deforming its internal structure, leading to the formation of these what are called shock lamellae within the crystal. Now, there are only two ways in which you get shocked quartz. The first one is a nuclear explosion, and to the best of my knowledge, the dinosaurs did not have nuclear weapons. The other way that we can get shocked quartz is as part of a meteorite impact. And so, once again, meteorite impact is obviously going to produce an event which has very, very high pressures, very, very high temperatures, and this is going to lead to the formation of shocked quartz. An impact would also go some way to explaining the soot layer. So if we just go back to the previous slide, you'll notice that above the clay layer right here, you can see you have this thick black band. And this thick black band is full of organic material, and it appears to be mostly made up of burnt plant material. So the question is, well, how did we end up with this big thick layer of burnt material? And the chance is that the material may well represent large-scale forest fires associated with the impact event. Now, this point is argued over to some degree, so I'm just going to tell you that for honesty's sake. But the soot layer, in theory, could be tied in to an impact event. And the final thing that we see is as part of the late Cretaceous sequence of rocks in some areas, we see the formation of massive tsunami deposits. So we see sedimentary rocks associated with tsunamis, and the sedimentary rocks we're seeing for the end of the Cretaceous Tertiary period, or at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, should I say, show in some areas these huge, thick tsunami sequences, which show there must have been a very, very large tsunami event. And once again, this would be consistent with an asteroid if the asteroid landed in the oceans, or at least on the coast. So just to give you some idea about just how powerful, but just how big, should I say, this iridium anomaly is, if we look at the graph here, you can see these are the standard ranges for iridium within the limestones below and above the clay layer. And you'll notice that as you hit the clay layer, which marks the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, you have this huge spike in iridium concentrations. So you're going from about half a part per billion iridium over here to over 3.5 parts per billion iridium over here. That's quite a substantial increase. So once you realize that an asteroid is the most likely cause of the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, you can begin to think about, well, how big would the asteroid have had to have been to cause the level of destruction that we see. And our calculations suggest that the asteroid in question would have probably been about 10 kilometers in diameter, and it would have produced a crater that was 180 kilometers in diameter and about 20 kilometers deep. So this is obviously a very big hole in the ground. Now, the formation of this crater will have displaced about 200,000 cubic kilometers of rock and sediment. And a lot of this rock and sediment would either have been instantly vaporized by the impact, or it would have been turned into very, very fine dust that would have been thrown up into the atmosphere. This fine dust is referred to as ejecta because it's getting ejected from the impact crater. So this dust would have gone up into the atmosphere, and it would have done a couple of things. Number one, the dust would have blocked out the sun, because the dust in the air is going to stop sunlight making it to the surface of the Earth. This is obviously going to have an effect on photosynthesizing organisms, and of course it's going to lead to their eventual demise. So the other thing that we see is that as the dust falls out of the atmosphere, it's going to lead to the formation of an ejecta layer, which we see as the clay horizon, this clay layer right here. So the next question is, well, where is the impact crater? And we're very, very lucky in that we managed to find the impact crater. It's located on Chicxulub, which is part of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Now, the crater itself was actually found accidentally during an oil survey. But once they had found it, they started taking samples and they identified the crater, and they managed to date it to 65 to 66 million years ago, which is exactly on the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, exactly when this mass extinction occurred. So what did the impact actually do? Well, if we look here, we can see this is a gravity map for the Yucatan Peninsula. So here we have the coastline of Mexico running along here. So to the south, we actually have dry land, and to the north, we have the Gulf of Mexico. And what you can see is, if you look at the gravity map, you can see you have these circular features associated there, and you have a semicircular feature that's coming around here. And these are the faults which are associated with the formation of the crater. So these are the result of the crater forming process. And so by looking at these, we can actually work out where the edge of the crater will fall. Now, another thing that we see is, because the rocks in the area got very, very heavily faulted as part of the crater making process, it means that these faults in the ground are going to be exploited by water. So you're going to get water moving underground using the fault plains as a path of least resistance. And so, because the rocks in this area are mostly made of limestones, the passage of the water along these fault plains is going to lead to the formation of caves. And eventually the roofs of these caves will fall in, and this is going to lead to the formation of sinkholes. And so if you look here, we have all of these white spots on the diagram, and these are all sinkholes. And what you'll notice is there's a distinct band of sinkholes coming around here, which is associated with this gravity high. And so what you're seeing here is, you're seeing essentially sinkholes forming along one of these very, very large faults, which was part of the crater forming process. And so this is another piece of evidence that shows us that we have a crater here. So we know the impact will have occurred in a coastal region. And this obviously helps to explain the presence of the mega tsunami deposits, because of course, if the meteorite goes into the oceans, of course that's obviously going to lead to the formation of a very, very large tsunami. Now, the ejecta, the material that's thrown out during the impact event, is obviously going to enter the atmosphere, and a lot of that material is going to end up blocking out the sun. Now, this period of time could have lasted anywhere from several months to a more recent study which suggests the sun could have been partially blocked out for anywhere in excess of 100 years. So this is, you know, an interesting problem. We know that the sunlight would have been blocked out by all this dust in the atmosphere. One of our issues is how long it took for that dust to exit the atmosphere and for sunlight to make it back onto the surface of the Earth in reasonable quantities. So the loss of this sunlight obviously would have been detrimental for photosynthesizing organisms, and so obviously we will have seen a lot of those photosynthesizing organisms dying off. Of course, this is going to then cause the food chain to collapse, because these small photosynthesizing organisms are essentially at the base of the food chain in the marine environment. Obviously, because we're blocking out the sun, we're also going to see a decrease in global temperatures, because no sunlight is making it to the surface of the Earth, so that means far less solar radiation. Obviously, as we've discussed, we're going to see the onset of massive wildfires associated with the impact, and this is going to lead to the destruction of large areas of forest. It's also going to lead to large amounts of carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere. The other thing that we notice is that the rock, which is vaporized by the impact, ended up putting quite large quantities of sulfur and nitrogen into the air. So it just so happens that the marine sediments tend to be relatively rich in sulfur. And so this means that when these marine sediments were vaporized as part of the impact event, a lot of that sulfur went into the atmosphere. And of course, when you have sulfur and you mix it with water, you end up forming sulfuric acid. When you have nitrogen, you mix it with water, you can end up forming nitric acid. And so this is going to lead to acid rain. And of course, acid rain is very, very bad, because depending on where it lands, it can either cause the pH of soil to decrease, or it could even, in extreme cases, cause the pH of the oceans to decrease. And of course, this is going to be very, very bad. If soil pH decreases, so it becomes more acidic, that can kill the roots of plants. And if the pH in the oceans decreases, that can make it very difficult for animals that have carbonate shells to survive, because the carbonate is going to be constantly reacting with the more acidic water. So was an impact the cause of the Cretaceous tertiary extinction? The answer is yes, and then again no. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, how come the dinosaurs died out, but the crocodiles, the turtles and the mammals managed to make it through? There clearly have to have been other factors operating during this time period. Now, data indicates that the dinosaurs, the flying reptiles and marine reptile populations in the late Cretaceous had on the whole been declining. And so this would suggest that the dinosaurs were already in trouble. There is, however, some evidence to suggest that right at the end of the Cretaceous, the dinosaurs might actually have been making a bit of a comeback, but it looks like this Cretaceous tertiary mass extinction seems to have put a stop to that. So the change in the dinosaur populations that we see as we're moving through the Cretaceous is likely a response to the change in global and regional climates which are being produced as the continents move towards their current positions. At the same time, we're obviously going to see a change in ocean currents as well as the continents move towards their current positions, and so that's going to affect marine organisms. And so what we see is we have both populations of animals on the land and in the oceans which are already being stressed by the breakup of Pangaea and the movement of the continents towards their current locations. And then on top of that, we then obviously have this impact. So in terms of marine environments, we see that the warm, shallow seas, which we had throughout much of the Mesozoic, especially in the Cretaceous, are also rapidly regressing. And so this is going to mean that habitats for animals like ammonites, rudist bivalves and marine reptiles essentially are going to be reduced. And so obviously that's going to make it more difficult for them to survive. We also still have the Deccan Traps eruption going on in India. That's going to be putting out huge quantities of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that's going to react with water to produce sulfuric acid. That's going to lead to acid rain. And we're also going to have the eruption putting out large quantities of chlorine and fluorine. That's also going to go into the atmosphere where it's going to react with ozone, so it's going to degrade the ozone layer. So what you essentially have is you have a situation where the dinosaurs, the flying reptiles, the marine reptiles, the ammonites, the rudists and other marine organisms are already in a pretty bad situation. And then just to top it off, you get this huge impact occurring, and that pretty much finishes them off. In contrast, other groups of animals like the crocodiles, the turtles and the mammals were on the whole doing pretty well in the Cretaceous. So it looks like they were on a relatively firm footing before this impact occurred, and so that managed to help them to make it through this event and make it into the Cenozoic, where they could then start diversifying. So let's finish this presentation by thinking about Pleistocene extinctions. So during the Pleistocene, the continental interior of North America was stuffed with horses, rhinos, camels, mammoths, mastodons, bison, giant ground sloths, glyptodonts, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, rodents, rabbits, to name but a few. Now, around 14,000 years ago, many of these animals became extinct, especially the larger ones. Now, unlike previous extinctions, the losses were primarily focused on larger animals, so animals greater than 44 kilograms in weight, and mostly mammals in North America, South America, and Australia. So in Australia, 15 out of the 16 genuses, that's 94% of the large mammals, died out. In North America, 33 out of 58 of the large animal genuses died out, so that's 57%. And in South America, 46 of 58 of the large mammal genuses died out, that's 79%. Now, in contrast, Europe only lost 7 out of 23 large mammalian genuses, so that's only 30%, and Africa south of the Sahara only lost 2 out of 44 large mammalian genuses. That's only a 5% loss. So you can see that something a bit weird is going on. So there are 3 questions that have yet to be fully answered. Number 1, what caused the Pleistocene extinctions? Number 2, why did these extinctions preferentially eliminate large mammals? And number 3, why were the extinctions focused on the Americas and Australia in particular? Now, at present, there are 2 competing explanations. The first one is called the climate change hypothesis, and this proposes that rapid climatic change at the end of the Pleistocene changed habitats, driving extinctions. The other possibility is called the prehistoric overkill hypothesis, and this one states that human beings were responsible because mammoth tasted great. Now, the rapid changes in climate and vegetation which occurred as the glaciers retreated during the late Pleistocene is well established. The North American and Northern Eurasian open steppe tundras were replaced with conifers and broadleaf forest as warm, wetter weather conditions became the norm. And so obviously animals which were used to these colder steppe conditions are going to be in trouble. So as the Pleistocene drew to a close, the Arctic region flora changed from a surprisingly productive herbaceous environment, which was capable of supporting numerous animal species, to a waterlogged tundra as the climate became wetter. So essentially what we had during the Ice Age was we had conditions that, yes, they were cold, but the plant life that was present was productive enough to support large mammals. As we move towards the end of the Ice Age, we see this productive environment disappearing, being replaced by a waterlogged tundra, which is nowhere near as productive, and so obviously the large mammals can't survive in those conditions anymore. In contrast, the southwestern United States changed from a wet environment with broadleaf trees, grasslands and numerous lakes and rivers, which was capable of supporting a diverse mammalian fauna including deer, bison, saber-toothed cats and mammoths, to a arid to semi-arid environment which is unable to support a diverse fauna containing large mammals. So once again, environmental changes driving the loss of large mammals in that region. Now, based on these examples, it would seem that the changing climate during the late Pleistocene could have had a serious effect on mammalian populations, but there are also a few problems with the climate change hypothesis. And these problems include: 1. Why did the animals simply not migrate as their preferred climate moved to higher latitudes? After all, reindeer used to live in France, but as conditions changed, they migrated north into the Arctic. Number 2, previous glacial advances and retreats did not cause mass extinctions, so why did this one? And number 3, Europe had the same climate as North America, so how come Europe wasn't as badly affected as North America when it came to the loss of large mammals? So this brings us on to the other possible cause of the Pleistocene extinction, and this is the prehistoric overkill hypothesis. And this argues that the mass extinctions in North and South America and Australia correlate with the arrival of human beings on those continents. So the hypothesis also suggests that as the fauna of these continents were not familiar with humans, they did not see them as a threat, and as such they were easily killed. In contrast, the animals of Africa and Europe knew humans quite well, they knew we were dangerous, and so they did their best to avoid us, and so the extinctions in these areas were nowhere near as severe. There are two arguments commonly employed against the overkill hypothesis. The first one states that early humans lived in small scattered communities, so how could a few sparsely distributed hunters decimate so many species? Now, the counter-argument to this point is that in the last 600 years, human beings have managed to decimate animal populations all over the world, with the Pacific Islands and New Zealand being particularly good examples. So, of course, in the Pacific Islands, we managed to kill off the dodo very efficiently, and in New Zealand, we managed to kill off several species of flightless Moas birds. Now, the counter-argument to the counter-argument states that yes, human beings do have the capacity to absolutely decimate animal populations. However, the human beings that have been doing this during the last 600 years have had access to guns and steel weapons, and these are a luxury that early human beings did not share, and so chances are these early human beings would have been nowhere near as efficient. The other argument against the overkill hypothesis states that hunters will wisely go for smaller, less dangerous animals. So the remains of horses, reindeer and other small animals are found at several prehistoric sites, but mammoth bones and woolly rhinoceros bones are very, very rare, and this would suggest that these animals were not part of the human diet in these communities because we can't see any indication of them having been consumed there. It has also been pointed out that human artefacts are not found among the remains of extinct animals, and large animal bones, so bones for animals like mammoths and rhinos, only show very rare or questionable signs of butchery. And of course, once you've killed an animal, you're naturally going to butcher it for the meat, and so you would expect to see things like flint marks on the bone which show you that the animal is being butchered, but we don't see those. So the counter-argument is that the impact of human hunting was so swift that the opportunity for substantial numbers of tools at hunting sites to build up is relatively low, and so this means that we were just so efficient that we didn't really have a long enough time period to lose lots and lots of pieces of equipment, and so the indications that human beings were operating in these areas are relatively few and far between. Some have also suggested that early hunters may have preferentially targeted the young of the large mammals and butchered them where they killed them. Now, the smaller skeletons would have been less likely to successfully fossilise, and this may well explain why we don't see indications of butchery on the bones of large mammals. So the reason for the Pleistocene extinction is uncertain, but the most likely explanation is a hybrid model where populations are already stressed from the effects of climate change, and this makes them more vulnerable to hunting, especially if the females and young are preferentially targeted. And of course, if you are removing the young preferentially, that's eventually going to lead to a population collapse.